My world was supposed to end the day I was fired for attending my father's funeral. Instead, my team decided to light a match and watch the entire corporate empire burn with me. For 8 years, Apex Innovations wasn't just a job, it was the entire framework of my life. I wasn't merely Sarah Vance, Senior Project Manager. I was a convert, a true believer in the company's sleek, aggressive mission. I had offered up my 20s to that glittering glass tower in downtown Chicago, fueled by the burnt, sludgy brew from the break room coffee machine and the hollow promise of the next rung on the corporate ladder. I was the one who answered emails at 2 in the morning, who viewed holiday weekends as a strategic opportunity to get ahead, and who genuinely believed that my relentless dedication would eventually be recognized and rewarded. Friendships faded and family milestones were missed, all for a company that was about to teach me the most brutal lesson of my life. To them, I was nothing more than a disposable asset. The man I answered to was Jonathan Pierce, the director of strategy. He was a caricature of modern hustle culture, a man who spoke in a dialect of buzzwords like synergy and disruptive innovation, but possessed the emotional range of a filing cabinet. In his worldview, loyalty was a one-way street that terminated directly at his office door. He didn't manage people, he leveraged human capital. Quarterly profit margins were his gospel, and he considered employee burnout a necessary, even admirable byproduct of true commitment. He cultivated a relentlessly demanding atmosphere where taking a sick day was a sign of weakness and using your full vacation time was an act of quiet betrayal. I once saw him corner a junior analyst who was trying to leave at 6 o'clock for his son's first t-ball game. "That's wonderful, Kevin," he'd said, a smile that never reached his eyes. "Just remember, while you're watching Little League, our competitors in Shanghai are closing deals. The market doesn't take a seventh inning stretch." That was Jonathan. I understood the game, and for 8 years, I had been his most valuable player. I never dreamed I would be the one to flip the entire board. The phone call that shattered my carefully constructed world came on a frigid Wednesday morning. It was my younger brother, his voice a choked, hollow whisper I'd never heard before. "Sarah," he managed to get out, "it's Dad." He didn't have to say another word. He had suffered a sudden, catastrophic aneurysm in his garage in the middle of rebuilding the engine of a vintage Mustang, his lifelong passion. He was just gone. My father was my anchor, a quiet, principled man who taught me that a job is what you do, but your life is who you are. He was the bedrock of our family, and in a single instant, that bedrock had crumbled into dust. The world went muted and gray, and a profound, crushing weight settled into my bones. Grief isn't an idea, it's a physical force. I felt it in my chest, a palpable pressure that made it hard to breathe. I felt the weight of my mother's broken heart and the sudden, terrifying responsibilities that had just been dropped onto my shoulders. There was no calculation to be made, no pros and cons to weigh. My family needed me home in Minneapolis. I sat down at my small kitchen table, the Chicago wind rattling the window pane, and opened my company laptop. I composed a short, professional email to Jonathan Pierce. I wasn't asking for permission, I was informing him of a fact. I explained that my father had passed away unexpectedly and that I would be taking 1 week of bereavement leave, a benefit explicitly outlined in the Apex Innovations Employee Handbook, to be with my family and help with the arrangements. I drew a shaky breath and hit send, a knot of ice forming in the pit of my stomach. I knew the man I was dealing with. His reply landed in my inbox less than 5 minutes later. It was a sterile masterpiece of corporate indifference, utterly devoid of a single syllable of condolence. It read, "Sarah, your situation is noted. However, the timing is suboptimal as it directly conflicts with the final push for the Q3 client deliverables. The entire team is under immense pressure to hit our targets. I trust you will make a decision that reflects your commitment to our collective success. So, Bino, Yaostes." I stared at the screen, my hands starting to tremble, not with grief this time, but with a sudden, incandescent rage. Suboptimal timing? Did he imagine my father had consulted the quarterly projection schedule before his brain betrayed him? I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to force the fury back down. My fingers felt like stone as I typed my reply. "Jonathan, I understand the pressure we are under. This is a family tragedy, not a scheduling inconvenience. This is not a request. I will be out of the office for the remainder of the week." His final email was the blade. Your failure to prioritize strategic imperatives at this critical juncture is considered a voluntary abdication of your professional responsibilities. Should you choose to be absent, we will proceed accordingly. That was it. I refused to give him the dignity of another response. I snapped the laptop shut. The sharp crack echoed in my silent apartment, a sound of finality. I threw a few essentials into a duffel bag and began the 6-hour drive north to my mother's house. The next few days were a blur of aching sadness, of phone calls to relatives, of meetings at the funeral home, of trying to write a eulogy for a man whose absence felt like a hole torn in the fabric of the universe. I suppressed my own sorrow, trying to be the strong one for my mother and brother, but in the quiet, dark hours of the night, Jonathan's cold, transactional words haunted me. I had made my choice. I knew the consequences were waiting for me back in Chicago. 1 week later, I walked back into the Apex Innovations office. The air felt charged and strangely thick, humming with an unspoken tension. As I crossed the open plan office, the usual comforting cacophony of clicking keyboards and hushed phone calls faded into an unnerving, profound silence. People I had worked with for years glanced up from their screens, their expressions a painful mix of sympathy and raw, nervous apprehension. I felt like I was a ghost walking through my own life. I kept my eyes fixed on the gray industrial carpet, making a straight line for my desk, bracing myself for the inevitable. I didn't have to wait. It was the first email in my inbox, flagged with high importance. The sender was Human Resources. The subject line was chillingly clinical, regarding your employment status with Apex Innovations. My heart started a frantic, heavy drumming against my ribs. I clicked it open. The body of the email was a fortress of corporate jargon and legal speak. Following your unapproved absence and failure to comply with direct management directives, your employment with Apex Innovations has been terminated, effective immediately. Unapproved absence. The words swam before my eyes. I had forwarded them a digital copy of the death certificate. They knew I was burying my father, and this was their verdict. My family's most devastating moment, reduced to a breach of protocol. A cold, hard anger began to crystallize inside me, displacing the grief and anxiety. I gripped the edge of my desk, my knuckles turning white, and focused on the simple mechanical act of breathing in and out. He actually did it, a low voice murmured beside me. The absolute coward. I always wondered where the line was for him. I guess now we know. I turned. It was David, our lead data architect, a man whose cynical exterior hid a brilliant and deeply principled mind. He had been at the company for over a decade and was the unofficial conscience of our department. His face was grim, but his eyes held a glint of steel I had never seen before. I couldn't speak. I just gave him a single sharp nod, a painful lump tightening my throat. He exhaled a long, slow breath. We all saw the email, Sarah. The monster forwarded your entire exchange to HR and his own boss to create a paper trail documenting your insubordination. He wanted to make an example out of you to keep the rest of us in line. It was then I noticed the silence again. It wasn't just quiet, it was absolute. Every single one of the 35 people in our division was looking at us. They weren't working, they were watching, they were waiting. Before I could process what was happening, David turned and walked back to his own desk. He didn't start gathering his things. He bent down, picked up a single sheet of paper from his printer tray, and began to walk with a slow, deliberate purpose toward Jonathan Pierce's glass-walled office in the corner. He knocked once, a loud, definitive rap that cracked the silence of the room. He didn't wait for a reply. He swung the door open and placed the paper squarely in the center of Jonathan's obsessively neat desk. "This is my 2 weeks' notice," David announced, his voice clear and resonant, carrying easily to every corner of the office. "I will not work for a man or for a company that fires a person for burying their parent." Jonathan Pierce's jaw went slack. He started to make a sputtering, incredulous noise, but it was immediately drowned out by the sound of another desk chair sliding back. Maria, our head of client relations and one of the most respected people in the entire company, stood up. She walked to her own printer, collected her letter, and followed the exact same path David had just forged. She placed her resignation directly on top of his. "I'm with David," she said, her voice firm and unwavering. "This is unacceptable." She turned and walked out of Jonathan's office, but she didn't return to her desk. Then another person stood. and another. It became a procession, a slow, solemn, and utterly defiant march. One by one, my colleagues, the people with whom I had weathered project crises and celebrated victories, rose from their chairs. These were the senior engineers, the top analysts, the project leads, the people who held the institutional knowledge. They were the heart and soul of the division. They each printed their resignations, formed an orderly queue, and laid them on the steadily growing stack of paper on Jonathan's desk. I sat frozen in my chair, watching this incredible scene unfold in complete heart-pounding disbelief. The color drained from Jonathan Pierce's face, leaving it a sickly, terrified shade of gray. He stumbled out from behind his desk, his voice a high, cracking whine. "You can't do this! You all have contractual obligations. This is career suicide. You are throwing everything away." No one even glanced at him. They simply placed their letters on the pile and then walked back, not to their workstations but to me. They formed a silent, protective semicircle around my desk, offering a hand on my shoulder, a quiet word of encouragement, a shared look of fierce, unyielding pride. This was no longer just about me. This was the breaking point. This was for every demeaning remark, every cancelled plan, every time they were made to feel that their lives outside of Apex were an inconvenience. My firing wasn't the cause of this mutiny. It was merely the spark that ignited a bone-dry forest. By the end of the afternoon, 24 people, including the entire senior staff and the leads of every critical project, had resigned. The office was a landscape of quiet, organized rebellion. Jonathan Pierce, the man who worshipped at the altar of control, stood impotently in his glass cage, staring at the mountain of paper that symbolized the swift and total collapse of his kingdom. Apex Innovations had tried to use me to enforce its culture of fear. Instead, my team had used me to show the world the true price of inhumanity. The next morning, my phone began buzzing on my nightstand and didn't stop. I had wanted to retreat from the world, to wrap myself in the quiet blanket of grief, and tried to absorb the emotional whiplash of the last week. But the constant stream of notifications was a flood I couldn't hold back. It was my now former colleagues. Our group chat was exploding with updates, gallows humor, and a strange, exhilarating sense of shared purpose. A message from Maria appeared on my screen. "You will not believe the pandemonium here. Pierce is having a complete public meltdown. Corporate sent 2 vice presidents down from the executive floor for an emergency intervention, but there's almost no one left for them to talk to. They're just now grasping that they didn't lose one employee. They lost the functional core of an entire division." I sat up in bed, a small, weary smile on my face. That feeling was quickly washed away by a powerful wave of gratitude. These people hadn't just quit. They had committed an act of mass professional defiance, all for a principle. An hour later, David called, his voice crackling with an energy I'd never heard from him before. "Sarah, you are not going to believe what just happened," he said, his voice loud with excitement. "The CEO just got involved." That made me sit bolt upright. "What, the CEO himself, Mr. Caldwell?" "The one and only," David confirmed, a triumphant laugh bubbling through the phone. "Turns out, when nearly the entire leadership of your most profitable division walks out on the same day, word travels upstairs with the speed of light. Starkwell Industries, our biggest account, called, demanding to know why their entire project team suddenly had out-of-office replies saying they no longer worked for the company. They threatened to pull their $15 million contract unless Apex rectified the catastrophic failure in senior management by the end of the business day." I was speechless. I had hoped Jonathan Pierce would get a slap on the wrist from HR. This was a 5-alarm corporate inferno, and he was standing at the epicenter. "And here is the absolute best part," David continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Caldwell himself came down from the 40th floor. He stormed into our department, took one look at all the empty desks, and just pointed a finger at Pierce's office. He didn't even go inside. He just motioned him into the main conference room. The walls are thick, but not that thick. We heard yelling, actual furious yelling. 20 minutes later, Pierce walked out with a security guard carrying a sad little cardboard box with his desk plant and a framed photo. He's gone, Sarah, terminated on the spot." I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "You have to be joking." "Deadly serious," David said. "Now HR is in full-blown panic mode. They are calling every single person who resigned, practically begging them to come back. They're offering retention bonuses, promising a full cultural overhaul, a new division head from outside the company, and get this, they want to offer you your job back. I just stared at the wall of my apartment, my mind reeling. In the span of a week, I had been shattered by grief, fired in disgrace, and now completely and utterly vindicated. The very company that had treated me as if I were disposable was now preparing to come crawling back. David seemed to read my mind. Look, I know what they're going to offer. They'll probably dangle a massive promotion, maybe even Pierce's old job, and a ridiculous salary to make this public relations disaster vanish. It's going to be tempting. But after what they did, after they showed you what they truly value, could you ever walk back in there and trust them again? He didn't need an answer. It was already there, solid and clear in my mind. No, I said, a profound sense of calm settling over me for the first time in what felt like an eternity. Not for all the money in the world. David let out a loud whoop of joy. That's what I was hoping you'd say. I spent the rest of that day on the phone personally thanking him, Maria, and every single person who had stood with me. They had shown me a kind of loyalty I had foolishly pledged to a corporate logo. Their loyalty wasn't to a company, it was to each other and to a shared belief in basic human dignity. A few days later, the formal offer from Apex Innovations arrived. It was a long, flowery document filled with disingenuous apologies for the unfortunate series of miscommunications. It offered me my job back, a promotion to division director, and a salary that was truly obscene. I read it once. Then, with a small, sure smile, I forwarded the entire email with the offer and all its empty promises to the group chat with David, Maria, and the rest of my renegade team. I added only one sentence of my own. It seems there's a director position available. I know 24 highly qualified candidates who are suddenly on the market. Let's go see what we can build together. I never went back. Most of us didn't. In the end, a core group of us, led by David and Maria, pooled our talents and our severance checks and started our own consulting firm. We built it on the one principle Apex had forgotten. Your people are your only true asset. It was a place where work-life balance was a non-negotiable policy, not a recruiting slogan. A company that understood that people have families, that they grieve, that they celebrate, and that empathy is the only real foundation for any lasting success. Apex Innovations, from what I heard, spent the next 2 years bleeding clients and struggling to rebuild the talent and trust it had so arrogantly set on fire. I lost my father, and that is a wound that will never completely heal. But in the wreckage of that grief and the ashes of that rebellion, I found something I never knew I was missing. I learned that my integrity was not for sale. And more importantly, I learned that sometimes the strongest family you have is the one that chooses, without a moment's hesitation, to stand with you and fight when the world tries to bring you to your knees.